Although we've all seen and learned about war our whole lives, seeing conflicts such as this one in Ukraine right now reminds us of the devastating impact on the lives of the innocent, especially when it occurs so close to our own homes and our own families. As members of an international community, it is our responsibility to attempt to understand international issues and take action to create a more peaceful and just world. However, conflicts such as this one can be difficult to understand without knowledge on the political and historical context behind them. So, today we pose the question, what were the leading causes of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and how can we as students help? Welcome everyone to our panel on Sustainable Development Goal 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions, focusing on the politics and history behind the war in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anna, I'm in 12th grade, and I will be your MC for today. Now, it is our great pleasure to welcome our two speakers for this panel, Dr. Fennell and Ms. Challenger. Dr. Jonathan Fennell is a reader in modern history at King's College London, co-director of the Sir Michael Howard Centre for the History of War and co-founder and president of the International Scholarly Society, the Second World War Research Group. He holds a doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford and is a prize-winning author of 2 books on the military and social history of Britain and the Commonwealth in the Second World War. Ms. Amy Challenger is an American expat, writer, and artist living in Zurich, having written in the Independent, HuffPost, and Mobs International magazine and blog, with some of her essays having been featured in several other publications. Ms. Challenger leads creative writing workshops online based on the Amherst Writers and Artists method, and works with refugees, providing us with a humanitarian insight to this panel. I would now like to hand over to Anne-Sophie, who is managing our call and collecting questions today.
Thank you, Anna. My name is Anne-Sophie, and I'm a senior at IZL, and I'll be organizing and checking questions this afternoon. We have about 45 minutes together, during which time we will engage in a conversation with our 2 panelists and provide some time for your questions. We will be using Mentimeter as a platform for questions. The code and QR code should now be displayed on your screen. Please take a moment to access our Mentimeter presentation either using the QR code on the screen or the code 69513340 through menti.com. So you can generate questions throughout the session, which I will then pass on to the interviewer. You are welcome to direct your question to a specific speaker and say who the question is from. I will now be handing over to Naz to begin our panel discussion.
Thanks, Anne-Sophie. My name is Naz, and I'm a senior at IZL. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this LIFES panel about the crisis in Ukraine. As we heard from Anna's introduction, it's a real privilege to be able to talk with 2 people who can provide insights on the devastating effects of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Thank you both for being here today. I would like to start with a clarifying question. For those who may not have been keeping up or who aren't knowledgeable about the topic, could you provide some historical and political context behind the war in Ukraine? Dr. Fennell, would you like to start?
Of course, and thank you. And I think it's a very smart question to ask first, which is, tell me the context. Smart people ask questions like that. You're not taking a theoretical view here. We're looking at trying to understand the facts on the ground and how they interrelate. So maybe 3 dynamics I'd pick out that I think would be worth reflecting on if you're interested in this. And I certainly think there's a dynamic number 1 might be a sense of insecurity that Russia feels. And, we could easily go back to 1812 and Napoleon's Grand Armée, attacking Russia, getting as far as Moscow and burning the city to the ground until it was defeated. Perhaps, and certainly more important, is 1941 and the German army's invasion of the Soviet Union as it was then. And I think it is almost impossible today to grasp the level of barbarity and horror that was experienced by ordinary Russians and indeed Ukrainians and other ethnic minorities within the Soviet Union over those years. I mean, some estimates bring it to between 20 and 30 million people died. And then you have to factor in all the other horrors that are associated with war. And that left a sense of insecurity. And in the years following 1945 and the end of the Second World War, a Cold War raged between what we sometimes refer perhaps as the West and the Soviet Union, a war of ideas and different viewpoints on how the world should be ordered. And when that Cold War ended at the end of the 1980s and the start of the 1990s, Russia was was concerned about its security, and concerned especially as post-1997 NATO, which was the kind of collective security organization that was supposed to defend Western Europe and North America, started to expand closer to the Russian border, further east. So there was a sense of insecurity that Russia felt. Now, I'm not saying that is a legitimate sense, but that is certainly what Russia's specialists would often say was the case. We might bring in just quickly two other things that are worth thinking about. I saw at the start of this, I started to wonder whether this was the first climate change war or the first war of the climate change era. And could Russia be playing for the black soil of the Ukraine in a context of reduced crop yields? And I don't know. I haven't seen that very present in the literature that it's online. But I wonder whether we should link it to some extent to some of the broader climate change issues of our day. And the last point I'll bring out for now is kind of how ethnic Russians are treated in the Baltic states and other parts of Eastern Europe. And again, this is a narrative that comes very strongly out of Russia, which is that ethnic Russians are mistreated in those spaces. I'm not saying for a second that is in fact the case, but that is certainly the impression that is given. From the Ukrainian perspective, so those are three issues for the Russians. I'll briefly just say, one thing certainly stands out. Two things stand out for me with Ukraine. One is that it is a proud people with an independent and unique history and culture all of its own. But also, if you look at Ukrainian history in the 1930s, it's just about as bleak as any part of the world. There's collectivization forced upon them. There are purges, famous purges if you do history in class, carried out by the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and there's famine as well. And so there's a sense, I think, amongst Ukrainians of what it is like to be ruled by Russians, and perhaps a fear of the consequences of that. So that's I think, a little bit of context. There's no doubt there's more to be said, but that should get us going.
Thank you so much. Ms. Challenger, do you have anything else to add using a more humanitarian angle on the subject?
Not to the history, I would say. I'm not the expert on the history, so I can't really answer that. I think he gave a pretty good background there. And just to be clear, I'm just learning myself, as all of you are, because I have experience working with refugees from all over the world, not specifically Ukraine. So most of the learning I've been doing has been directly with refugees for the last, month, coming from Ukraine, and then the studying that I've been doing in the news, and then just by asking a lot of questions myself. So, I've already been working a lot with the Swiss authorities about the process of seeking asylum, and so that's a lot of what I've been doing my research on as it's been changing, like literally every week in Switzerland. So I'm better to comment sort of on that side of things as people arrive. I can give you a lot of information that I've gotten from Ukrainians as they have fled, which I'm ready to do and wanting to do when you ask the right question. Thank you.
I was wondering, could you give an overview of the situation with the refugees as you experienced it?
Sure. Well, what I would really like to do is to tell you firsthand some of the stories that I've been told, because I see myself as more of a bridge between refugees as they come in and a listener. And then I hope with writing and with forums like this to share what I learned so that we can learn how to do a better job of integrating refugees as they cross borders. And so I asked some of the residents who have recently moved into my neighborhood your questions, and just wanted to find out what their answers were, because I feel like they're more qualified to answer, really. So here's what the first resident said, and this is really unedited because it didn't need to be edited. when we were fleeing Ukraine, it was impossible to stop even for a minute because every minute could cost us our lives. And when you have small children with you, you understand that you're obliged to save them and move on despite fatigue, both moral and physical. We traveled through several countries in search of at least some living conditions, but what we saw in your country shocked everyone. We received not only very good conditions, food, and a roof over our heads, but we received warmth and support from the local population and everyone, employees who helped us survive in such a difficult period of our lives. Thanks to people with such a big and kind heart and the support of your country, I want to live. So that came from a 25-year-old refugee who just had her birthday this week here in the center. Then here's another, actually, no, that one was not the 25. This is from the 25-year-old. Those who witnessed the mass death of people, the neglect of the value of human life in their homeland, experience severe psychological problems. At a new place of residence, they do not disappear, but on the contrary, are supplemented by experiences and difficulties in perceiving the current reality. Many of us, I think this is really important, have never left our homeland. And now we've had to flee to a foreign country, crossing many borders, leaving our homes, our husbands, and our jobs. And then later she says, but when you come to a new country, you meet a lot of people with huge, kind eyes who try to help the maximum, and the fear gradually subsides. We experience a huge storm of emotions when we see tears in the eyes of strangers with a different mentality. We feel powerless because we cannot adequately thank them. A big surprise was the powerful support and assistance of local residents. Each of us will keep this feeling of gratitude and take it with us to Ukraine, and we will tell our future children about it. So that was from a younger woman. Do I have time to read more, or is that I've gotten quite a few comments, so if you'd like me to stop, I will.
That's something we wanted to touch on a little bit later in the panel as well. So.
Oh, okay.
Don't worry about it at all. We can dive a little more into your personal experience with the refugees a little bit later, I was hoping.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, though.
Sure.
One of the shocks that we experienced is that the conflict that we seem to escalate so quickly. Dr. Fennell, could you outline why this might not actually be true?
Yes, so if we go back to 2014, there were political movements in 2013, political movements within Ukraine that were critical of Russia's influence within Ukraine and very keen to bring Ukraine closer to Europe and potentially also to NATO. In the end, that led to very significant political changes which Russia looked upon with, quite a lot of negativity. And then we know that there was the invasion of the Crimea and the occupation of the Crimea, which was illegal, the occupation of parts of Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And over the years since then, there's really been continual conflict. Anybody who's been willing to look that way could see that there were people dying and people fighting. Now, we've been distracted for 100 reasons, and obviously more recently with everything that's been going on with COVID, but it's been ongoing. And I think we can see the evidence of that in how remarkable the performance of the Ukraine military has been over the last month or so. They've been preparing. They've been imagining what might happen and putting in place necessary procedures to deal with it. So yeah, and I guess for those at the start of the year when we had all those predictions by intelligence agencies saying that Russia were about, it felt like an invasion in slow motion, didn't it? It was like people were saying they're going to invade, and then you had experts saying they would never be that silly, surely not. So it seemed to just come along at a very slow pace, which I don't think helped the Russian agenda in any way at all.
As a sort of follow-up question, what do you think Putin's long-term goals were, maybe by invading Ukraine?
Yes, what are his real reasons? Let's get into it. we don't know. So the long and short of it is nobody knows. Okay. So I'm an historian, and so I make my living going into archives and reading the minutes of the committee meetings that made these big decisions, right? And at the moment, none of us can see the minutes of those meetings. Nobody knows exactly what's going on inside his mind and the mind of his advisors. So we have to do our best to read around, try and understand. And it requires a huge amount of creativity and imagination, doesn't it? To try and stand in their shoes and try and understand emotionally and intellectually why they're making the decisions they're making. So, all the stuff you do at school, right? The hard maths, the analytics. Fundamentally important that you're also creative and imaginative if you're trying to understand the world we live in. My sense of key things we might reflect upon is opportunism. I think he made a calculation, not dissimilar, unfortunately, from some of the calculations that were made by Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, that his opponents were fundamentally weak and divided and incapable of standing up to real aggression by real, he drips with all this kind of awful misogyny, that he had somehow some powers that others didn't have. And, to an extent, you can understand how he might make that calculation. We've been through 2 years now, it feels like 2 decades of pandemic and all the challenges that has put on families. And it's interesting linking back into Amy, right? Our unit of analysis here ought perhaps be families rather than states, and maybe we'll come back to that. But we have had financial problems over many years. We've just had the humiliation for America and the United Kingdom and other countries of Afghanistan, where they've run away, pretty much. We've had Trump. We've had Brexit, which appears to rip the heart out of the European Union, the strategic foe. So you can kind of understand his decision-making process. What I think, he's obviously made a miscalculation. His hope was clearly to do it fast, to decapitate the Ukrainian state through a coup de main, sort of speed and aggression would sort it all out. And he seems to have misunderstood what war does and what war is. I'll make this my final point, I'll hand back to you. I think he thought he could control the situation. He was, the great man theory, he could control it. But war is uncontrollable. It is a beast let loose that is not a function of policy, not a function of politics. It is something all in itself. And as soon as you let it free, you become at its mercy. And he is learning that lesson now. And we might go into more about that in a second, but I'll hand back.
Thank you so much. You were just mentioning about all of the factors that affected Putin's decision. Why do you think that there are so many different variables that go into Putin acting in a way that may seem illogical to people?
You want to have a crack at that? Well, you tell me, right? Human beings are infinitely complex, infinitely diverse. There's no simple answer to any human question. And so, when you come back to your very first point, right, about context, smart people are always interested in context. They're always interested in the patterns of facts. They never come up with simple solutions because there are no simple solutions to complex human problems. So I think it looks complex because it is complex. And anybody who tells you that it isn't they're lying, they're a fool, or they're probably trying to sell you something. Human beings are complex, and I think that's why it looks so complex. And the funny thing is, right, that pushes a lot of weight back onto you, doesn't it? Because there isn't some easy solution for you to just learn. People like me and Amy can come in here and tell you here's what I need you to think. Because it's never that simple. What we need you to be able to do is to think yourself and to see through that complexity, which is awfully difficult, and why education is so important.
I have one last point that I would like to ask you about. Earlier, when you were mentioning about the historical and political context, you mentioned the era of a climate change war. Could you possibly expand on what you meant by that?
Yeah, I guess I'm playing around a little bit, and I climate change is putting all sorts of pressures on states, and will do more as the decades progress. It does appear that there are reduced crop yields, say for instance in places like Russia and other parts of the world that are experiencing more extreme effects of climate change already. Hitler invaded, the Soviet Union, not least over a concept called Lebensraum, which you've probably come across at some stage in your education, right? He wanted to get his hands on agricultural land that was rich, that would allow the German people to be self-sufficient. A little bit like, as he perceived, the United States, with its huge Midwest that he had access to. A little bit like the British Empire at the time, with its access to all parts of the world and its crops and its natural resources. So if there are fewer resources as a consequence of climate change, there becomes a necessity to get your hand on what's left. Or perhaps that is the calculation that he is making, and that is based not on massive, that is based on playing around a little bit. I did think at the start, perhaps this was the beginning of stuff like that. I guess we'll find out. Perhaps not.
So do you think perhaps this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it could be repetitive because of the lack of resources caused by climate change?
Yeah, I think the heart of your question is a good one. Human beings today are probably no more moral or better than those in the past. And we've seen the pretty appalling behavior of those who went before us in many places. And so I think, I know we were going to come later to what this all might mean for you and our future. It is real that these things can happen. Small groups of people paid off by a powerful head of state can coerce a people into behaving in truly appalling ways. The world is so fragile. The things we take for granted, such as democracy and freedom, were hard fought for and hard won. And as soon as we take them for granted, we start losing little bits here and there. And we see it, whether it's in socioeconomic relations within countries or whether it's within international relations between countries. And, again, we throw it back onto you, the next generation, the future. You're going to have to make those fights and sacrifices to ensure that the world is a decent place to live in. Because there'll always be those pressures. There'll always be people with short-term goals who are bullies, who are willing to try these things. And I don't think we're at the end of history. I don't think we've any guarantee of peace and security. We have to fight for it and earn it and think and solve problems together.
Thank you so much for your intriguing answer. We're going to switch gears a little bit now and look at the conflict from a more humanitarian angle. Ms. Challenger, what problems have been faced by refugees trying to flee from this crisis?
So I jumped ahead a little, didn't I? But I started giving you my notes here. But I think one of the things, first I want to just say, just to link to what Jonathan said, I think that this idea of insecurity is really interesting because not only does Putin's insecurity is transformed or transferred to the people. And I think that as you watch the Ukrainian people, we watch them as a world decide how they're going to respond. And so many people have made such difficult choices that are almost impossible for us living in our safe, I'm in Switzerland, in what we often call the bubble, for us to even conceive of. And so what I want to do is to try to understand that so that we can not only support refugees, but try to prevent this from happening again. And I think that that's the benefit of us, of what you're doing, and of us getting to actually know people who have been through these stories. So they're not just stories anymore. So they're not just things that we read about in the news. And I feel like we, in a way, are blessed that we have been able to open up our bubble and, and hear these stories and meet these people and learn from them. And that is just a great thing about being in Switzerland for you guys and being part of an international community. So, but the challenges that they face, I feel like, are becoming suddenly insecure people. The people I've met are people with really, really great lives. I mean, I've met people who said, yeah, life was hard in Ukraine. I happened to meet a journalist. She was one of the first refugees I met. And she said, it was really hard because I earned my money. I lost my money in 2014. Then I earned it again. I had my own apartment. And now I've lost everything again, and I have to start all over. And that made her feel really insecure. She's a young woman who has to start all over. And it's so easy for me to come alongside of her and say, you can do it, but I have never faced anything like that in my life. So I've met people, I've met a head of IT, I've met a teacher, I've met a couple who, they were entrepreneurs. They had their own business. They have 3 children, and their business was in sustainable water systems for residential properties. So they showed me their whole website. They showed me the system that I think most of us would love to have as part of our home. It's like a cistern, and it circulates the water back into your house and filters it. And these people were living, as confident, educated and law-abiding citizens, and suddenly without a way to even access their bank accounts. And they feel, a lot of them have told me they feel shame. And I feel shame. And I think the world needs to feel shame for any of these people bearing that burden on their own. That's how I feel. Because we live in a global economy, and we are not only are we affecting the environment with our actions, but with our spending. And so we're tied to these people as they come over the border. And sometimes I feel that when we think of them, suddenly you ask, what has been their big challenge? I think for this population I've met, they became refugees overnight. And their message has been, I'm not a refugee. I am a teacher. I am a student. I was planning to go to college. And so they're bringing us closer to how close refugees really are to each one of us. Whereas the refugees I've known who have been fighting for I get a little emotional when I talk about this, excuse me, but who've been fighting for the right to work for years, they've accepted their refugee status, and they've accepted the fact that they're just known as refugees. And so they very rarely even think to say to me, I didn't know I would ever be a refugee, because by the time they've made it to Switzerland, they've lived all kinds of ways just to get here. Whereas the Ukrainians are coming, and they're just suddenly overnight have lost everything and have become refugees. And so I feel like as a Swiss and an international community, it is our responsibility to say, you are no different from us, and we recognize that. Any one of us could become displaced with the way the world is right now, really. And so we're not doing you a charitable, real favor by offering, this is how I feel, by offering our time, but it is our responsibility. That's how I feel.
Thank you so much. To give a little further context, how has Switzerland aided these refugees, and also what kind of role do you play in helping these refugees daily?
So you're talking about the Ukrainians, right? How Switzerland helps the Ukrainians? Okay. Switzerland has opened their doors I mean, you probably know the answer to this because you're seeing it everywhere. But I mean, just everybody wants to help. Everybody's, if they have room in their homes, right, they're opening their doors. I'm sure there are some people who don't want to help. I just haven't met them. I am just blown away. Like, for me, it's a dream come true what I've seen. Even at the Bundesasylum Zentrum in the city where I have been volunteering since it opened, it has changed there for Ukrainians. So, they're getting registered, they're getting fingerprinted, they're getting, some of them are getting put in hotels and hostels if they don't have a home. If they don't have food, there's a way for them to get food. I would say that the biggest problem that they're all facing, which is totally expected, is that everybody's disorganized and stressed out and trying to get the information. And people, I think it's actually pretty funny because people are sort of complaining about that. And I think it's amazing what Switzerland's done in such a short amount of time. So I think it's normal that it wouldn't all go smoothly. And, as long as, what I keep saying is that as long as people are housed and getting food and getting compassionate treatment, we're doing awesome. And so that's what I've seen for the Ukrainians. And now, as you probably know, there's the S permit. They can, as soon as they get it in the mail, which is nobody knows how long that takes because no one can give answers because everyone's too busy to give answers. But once they get their S permit, they can get jobs. They get social services right away. They get medical care. But I would say the greatest thing they've all gotten is just compassion, just crazy compassion. And I feel like that is something to witness in a lifetime that I've never seen anything like it.
That is amazing to hear. Thank you so much. And with that, we would like to transition into the Q&A section of this panel. Thank you, speakers, for answering the questions so thoroughly. I will now hand over to Anne-Sophie as a reminder of how you can submit questions for our speakers.
Thank you, Naz, and thank you already to all the people who have submitted questions through the Mentimeter. Before we begin the Q&A session, I would like to remind everyone about the Mentimeter. Sorry. The Mentimeter code and QR code should once again be displayed on your screen. If you have not already done so, please access our Mentimeter presentation either using the QR code on the screen or so you can send in your questions to our panelists, which I will then pass on to the interviewer, Naz. You're welcome to direct your question to a specific speaker and say who the question is from. I'll now hand over back to Naz to start asking audience questions.
All right, I will start with the questions that I have. So firstly, I believe, Dr. Funnell, this is a question for you. How could this conflict affect the world other than economically?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for a start, mass migration creates pressure within the countries that receive individuals, and it creates space for narratives that are less than positive, I think, at times. And when states go through hard times, and we're seeing it in many ways with the kind of narratives that the Russians are building now, it becomes very easy to start using either or intellectual kind of constructs. Either we get rid of the refugees or something bad happens. And an increasing discussion around more extreme ideas that can lead to challenging politics. So I think in any time of dislocation, there's always space for radical and sometimes really quite dangerous thinking. I mean, it is potentially destabilizing on a national internal level, but also potentially destabilizing on an international level. And states will make their own decisions based on what they've seen. Some are saying that the difficulty that Russia is facing now will deter China from having a crack at Taiwan, which seems to be part of its strategic calculus in the long term. But we're only a month into this conflict, and as things change, it could in some ways embolden dictators, embolden those who would seek to pursue their ends through violence rather than through negotiation and compromise and creativity. So it's impossible to tell. It's a very good question. Hopefully people will learn that violence is an utterly pointless way to solve problems. It gets us absolutely nowhere, and yet people keep trying to do it. Real imagination and bravery and courage is, I think, about compromise. And it comes back, I think, some of the words that Amy used, like imagination and the kind of emotional intelligence that we don't talk nearly enough about. If you can imagine what it's like to be a refugee, because that teacher, that person is your mom or your dad, with just a different accent or a different face. And if we can do that a little bit better, we'll have a lot less of what's going on in Ukraine.
I have another question here for you. What do you think would happen to Russia's legitimacy if the war ended now?
Well, it depends which way does the war end, okay? So if all of a sudden Ukraine collapsed, let's say Russia manages to replay what it tried to do on day one, which is, the thunder run to Kiev, they killed Zelensky and his family and put in place a puppet regime. Well, that seems to be a legitimization of brutality, of aggression, and that could indeed have, domino effects and an encouragement for others who would seek to use these. If, on the other hand, the war ended tomorrow, amid a morale collapse within the Russian military, a very quick retreat to the previous borders of Russia, or at least within the Donbass region, I think it says a lot about it. It could possibly have positive repercussions. It could make aggressors think again, and perhaps educate the world again of how horrible war is, and how unpredictable it is, and how the will of the people should still matter. The Ukrainians said, "We do not want to be ruled by you," and that you have to take into account public will. And that's something he doesn't seem to have to do, right? He can coerce, control his own people. That is not the case for everybody. So it depends. It depends on the outcome, right? But it's a good question.
Thank you so much. Ms. Challenger, question for you. How is the pandemic affecting the conditions in camps where Ukrainian refugees are being received?
That's a good question. The refugees, well, the camps where the refugees are being received, the traditional camps, are mostly full of refugees from other countries, a lot from Afghanistan, and there really has not been a lot of awareness of the pandemic in the refugee camp where I worked. However, the activity center where usually they get to do their fun activities was closed because of COVID, and it just opened up. So actually it's a really big question because we had to cancel our activities, even though we were really excited it finally opened, because the Ukraine tents came and blocked the activity center. So the Afghan teams who could really benefit from having visitors are not able to have visitors now. But I would say, like, the pandemic, people seem to have forgotten about it. So I haven't really seen any effect from COVID. No, I haven't.
Another question that we had quite a lot phrased in different ways is that what can we as individuals do to help refugees and those left in the Ukraine?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think to continue to do what we're doing in Switzerland, but with a little bit of an adjustment, which is patience. I think everybody wants to help, but maybe it's really important to take a breath before helping and to ask really good questions and get to know the refugees who arrive and find out what their needs are before we sort of put our beliefs about refugees on them. Sometimes I prefer to talk about refugees as just people, like, that doctor I met or that teacher I met or that new mom in the neighborhood, and then find out what they need before helping. Because sometimes otherwise what we know are when people are new in a neighborhood, they need friends. They need to know how to find the trash. They need to know how to get their little cart out of the grocery store, and they may need to know where social services are and how to get a new doctor and those things. But we also know, as most of us are in the international community and we've immigrated here ourselves, whether temporarily or long term, we know that it would be really scary to us if like 30 people showed up at our door and left us with their stuff that they didn't want. So it's really important for us to get to know them on their own terms and then to respond to their needs, the people who come here. And then to the people who are still in Ukraine, I think we follow the lead of people who are from Ukraine and who can tell us what those needs are. And what's so cool is a lot of these refugees who have come have turned right around and started helping each other and have started helping the efforts to help those still in Ukraine. And so we want to promote them to those positions and really listen to them and give them the dignity that they should have in this whole conflict, this whole war.
Dr. Fennell, do you have anything else final to add?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points jump out at me. I mean, I love the terms that have been used in some of the questions and in the way you yourselves have framed some of these issues. So, I mean, and indeed, Amy, we talk about legitimacy. Such an important word when we're talking about any human behavior, any human experience. Complexity, contingency, empathy, imagination, fragility. And maybe those are not always the words and the concepts we put to the fore when we're engaging with these types of problems. We talk maybe about hate and strategy and analysis, which are certainly strategy and analysis are important. But some of those more human elements, I think, are essential to solving crises and fighting for peace rather than for other things. And I just thought a nice kind of link, I think, between what everybody has said is the extent to which all these grand ideas and the ambitions of states have to be rooted within the lived experience of ordinary people. You feel in a way that Putin's ambitions in Ukraine are not easily understood or shared by the Russian people. I mean, the Russian people are proud, and so broadly speaking, they support their country. But it's not clear that there's a clear understanding of what it's about. And you would feel from the outside that this can't be in the interests of Putin. Whereas on the other hand, what seems to be the case is he's translated the interests of the state into language that makes sense for ordinary people and their families. And when you do that, you create really powerful political movements. When you're connected to real people, the very work that Amy's doing, real people with families who love each other, and that's often the driving force in a lot of these things. So that would be my final point, which is that some of these maybe lesser discussed concepts and ideas and human skills are as important as some of the other stuff you'll read about in the newspapers.
I'm afraid that's the end of our session with our guests. Thank you, everyone, for listening and sending in your questions, and thank you to our speakers for sharing their knowledge, experiences, and ideas. We wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you.